Okay, the next step is we're going to start the assemble of the X slide piece. It's going to be sitting like so. And the first thing to do is put on one of these end brackets. It's going to get assembled on this end, and we're going to be assembling this end that has the motor or the big hole in it. Now notice that the holes for the motors and the bearings, depending on which side of the end bracket you're using, aren't actually centered. They're off-centered a little bit. What we want to do is mount this bracket so that the motor hole is towards the front of the machine, like so. Anyway, so we're basically just going to take this and put it so that use 3 of these 1032 screws. Oops. So now with the end bracket in place, we're going to go ahead and get ready to install the motors. The first thing we need to do with the motors, though, before we install them, is to take our flexible couplings. Now if you notice, the flexible couplings have 2 different style ends. One has a, zoom in on this if you can. One has a 1/4 thread in it. The other one is a smooth 5mm bore. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the end with a smooth 5mm bore, and we're going to take a 1/16 inch Allen wrench, and we're going to assemble this onto the shaft. And what you want to do is have, you can zoom in here, the end of the shaft should be just flush with the inside surface of the coupling. So the shaft should be smooth flush across here. And when you tighten down the set screw, it just needs to be kind of finger tight. You don't really need to really wail on the set screw, because the torque of the motor is actually not that great that you have to worry about it slipping. So we'll go ahead and do this with all 3 motors. And then when we actually put the motor in, for the X slide, what we're going to do is mount it in the bracket like so. And we're going to take 4 of our little M3 screws, and we're going to mount them, screw the motor in place here. I'm going to set this down here. Get the screw started. Now one thing you want to make sure, when you mount this motor, when it's sitting in position, you want to have the connectors and all these wires facing downward to keep them out of your way when you're machining. And also in general, while you're working with the assembly, you want to be very careful of these small wires, because you don't want to get them snagged on anything and break any wires. The next 2 motors will go into the YZ slide. They get mounted, one gets mounted in the back hole here. And again, you notice this this hole is, on the inside, is offset to one side. And if you notice, this hole in the back has a little bit more clearance on one side, and that clearance is for these cables, so that you have room for them. So this motor will get mounted in here so that the connectors have this extra little clearance on the side here. And on the inside, you see everything mounts nice and flush. On the, go ahead and pull this back out. The other one gets mounted on the bottom side through this hole. And again, if you look, you'll see that the hole, there's a little bit of extra clearance on one side. So again, when you mount the motor inside here, there will be a little bit of extra clearance on the one side for the cables. So I'll just go ahead and put these in. Okay, so now we've got all 3 of our motors in place here. The next step is to work on our drive screws. This is 1/4-20 threaded rod that you can get at the hardware store. You can buy it, most commonly it's got a zinc plating on it. It's actually better if you can find some that is unplated, just plain steel rod. It tends to be a little bit smoother because the plating will leave tiny little, lumpy bits of zinc. One thing you want to do after you cut your rod off and then you take a file and you smooth down your ends, is one thing you might want to do is smooth the rod down, that you can do by essentially putting a nut on the rod and then actually taking another couple of nuts, put them on the end, lock these two nuts together, and then what you can do is put them in cordless drill. So with the two nuts locked together and then put in a cordless drill, you can take a third nut and you can run it up and down on the shaft, applying a little pressure in each direction. As you drive it in, you push away. As you drive it out, you pull it in. And what this will do is essentially tend to smooth the surface of the threads. Another way to do this, if you have a wire wheel and a drill press, what you can do is put the wire wheel in the drill press and then use the wire wheel to basically burnish the surface of the rods, because you want the rods fairly nice and smooth. Again, this is less of an issue if you can find threaded rod that has that's not plated. Okay, now that we have our rod smoothed down, we want to test the fit of the rod with these split nuts that are the drive nuts for each axis. Now if you can zoom in, you can see these nuts are essentially cylindrical sections. They've got a thread in one end, and then there's a slit which allows these two ends to kind of flex together a little bit. What happens is the diameter of the threaded rod actually varies from batch to batch. And what you want to have is, as you thread this nut onto the rod, you'll probably feel a little bit of play in the axial direction of the nut on the rod. And what you want to do is very carefully take a pair of pliers, and if you feel play in this direction, what you want to do is take some pliers and squeeze down across that slot. And what that'll do is that'll actually bend these two halves in ever so slightly, and then refit it and see how it feels. What you want to do is you want to have so that you don't feel any play, but you also don't really feel any appreciable friction in driving the nut. The nut should rotate very freely with very light finger pressure, but also you don't want to feel any play along this axis, along the axis of the shaft.